The sliding glass doors of the airport hissed open, letting in a gust of cool air conditioned to perfection. James Carter adjusted the strap of his leather carry-on bag, the weight of it pulling slightly on his shoulder. The terminal was as alive as it always seemed to be, murmurs of families reuniting, clipped exchanges of hurried business travelers, the occasional laugh breaking through the din. Yet, amidst the bustling humanity, James couldn't shake a peculiar stillness that settled over him every time he entered this space. Airports were their own kind of theater, he thought. Everyone had a role to play, a script they followed, though not all parts were equal. The line at security snaked its predictable course. James joined it, nodding politely to a woman in front of him who was juggling a toddler and a stroller. He had gotten used to the waiting to board, waiting to land, waiting to be seen. It was a quiet rhythm he had learned to endure over the years. Though today, it felt heavier. He clutched his boarding pass and ID in one hand, slipping his phone into his pocket with the other. The man in front of him, a well-dressed gentleman with a silver watch glinting on his wrist, tapped his foot impatiently, sighing audibly every few seconds. James smiled faintly. Impatience was a luxury. As the line inched forward, he observed the ritual unfolding ahead. Shoes off, belts unbuckled, laptops in trays. There was a curious choreography to it, a shared understanding among strangers. Yet, there was an edge, too subtle but unmistakable. Eyes darted, appraised, assessed. The air carried a quiet tension, one most people had grown so used to they hardly noticed it anymore. James noticed it. He always did. When his turn came, he placed his bag on the conveyor belt and stepped through the scanner. He kept his movements deliberate, careful not to rush. The scanner beeped, a sharp, mechanical sound, but not unexpected. James paused, waiting for the next instruction. The TSA officer, a middle-aged man with a broad frame and a badge that glinted under the fluorescent lights, raised a hand. Step aside for additional screening, the officer said, his tone flat but firm. James nodded once, stepping where he was told. He didn't argue, didn't protest. He never did. Instead, he stood there, calm, collected, as the line moved past him. Behind him, he could feel the weight of eyes. A middle-aged woman glanced his way before quickly looking away. A younger man adjusted his headphones, pretending not to notice. The silence in the space around him grew louder. The officer began the pat-down. Hands brisk but thorough. James stared straight ahead, focusing on a poster across the room advertising some sunlit tropical escape. The irony wasn't lost on him. He didn't flinch when the officer ran his hands along the seams of his jacket or patted down his legs. It was a routine he knew well, almost intimately. It didn't surprise him anymore, though it still had the power to leave a hollow ache in his chest. All clear, the officer finally announced. Stepping back, James picked up his bag, nodding politely. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, though the words left a bitter taste in his mouth. He didn't look back as he walked away, though he could feel the collective relief of the passengers behind him. Glad it wasn't their turn to be scrutinized. Finding a seat near his gate, James sat down and exhaled slowly. From his vantage point, he could see the world moving on as though nothing had happened. A child tugged at his father's sleeve, begging for a snack. A group of friends posed for a selfie, their laughter bubbling over. The moment of his inspection was already forgotten by everyone but him. It wasn't new. It wasn't shocking. It just was. As he leaned back, his eyes wandered to the rows of travelers around him. To them, he was just another man waiting for a flight. But James knew better. He was never just another man. Not here, not anywhere. And so he waited, quiet and still, as the terminal hummed with life around him. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tieng An Viet Chuang Tu Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Kua Van Da Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hang Enge. Doi Tuong Noi Nghe La Noi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 2. The Incident. The gate area was a subdued chaos. A patchwork of people settling into their seats, scrolling on phones, and exchanging quiet words. James Carter sat with his bag resting at his feet, his ticket tucked neatly into the front pocket of his jacket. Around him, life carried on as it always did in these spaces, marked by an undercurrent of shared anticipation. Yet, there was a difference, an unspoken hum in the air that only he seemed to feel. He didn't dwell on it. He never did. A boarding announcement crackled over the intercom, the attendant's voice polite but perfunctory. The pre-boarding process began, and James rose, joining the line that formed almost instantly. His group was called soon after, and he moved forward, handing his ticket to the gate agent with a brief nod. She scanned it and handed it back without looking him in the eye. "Have a good flight," she murmured. "Thank you," James replied, though he wasn't sure she'd heard him. As he walked down the jet bridge, his mind wandered, replaying the security screening. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But something about it lingered. Perhaps it was the way the officer's hands had hovered just a moment too long, or the way the other passengers had avoided his gaze. It wasn't anger he felt, he had long since stopped expecting fairness, but rather a quiet weariness that settled deep into his bones. He stepped onto the plane, greeted by the cabin crew with rehearsed smiles. The flight attendants directed him toward his seat, and he moved with practiced efficiency, stowing his bag and settling into the window seat. The row filled quickly, a young woman with headphones taking the aisle seat. She glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable, before turning her attention to her phone. He didn't mind. The silence suited him. The plane filled with the familiar sounds of boarding, the thud of bags in overhead compartments, the shuffle of feet on carpeted aisles, the occasional cough. James watched out the window as the ground crew bustled below, their movements precise and coordinated. There was something comforting about their work, a kind of rhythm that felt removed from the world inside the plane. Then, a voice cut through the background noise, sharp and firm. "Excuse me, sir. I need to check your seat assignment." James turned his head slowly, already knowing the voice was directed at him. A flight attendant stood in the aisle, her posture stiff, clipboard in hand. Her smile was tight, almost brittle. "I'm sorry," he said, keeping his tone even. "Your seat assignment," she repeated, her voice louder now, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "I need to verify it." James blinked, his brows furrowing slightly. "It's on my ticket," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He handed it to her, careful to keep his movements deliberate. The attendant examined the ticket as if searching for something that didn't belong. Her eyes flicked between the ticket and James, her expression unreadable. Finally, she handed it back, her fingers brushing against his briefly before pulling away. "Thank you," she said, her tone clipped. "Just a routine check." Routine. The word lingered in the air, carrying with it a weight James knew all too well. As the attendant moved on, he glanced around the cabin. A few passengers were watching him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Most quickly looked away when his gaze met theirs. The young woman beside him shifted in her seat, her face unreadable. James caught her glancing at him out of the corner of her eye but said nothing. He turned back to the window, watching as the plane began to taxi. Outside, the world seemed to move on, unbothered by the small moment that had just unfolded. Inside, the weight of it lingered, silent but palpable. He leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. The plane lifted off, the ground falling away beneath them. James closed his eyes, letting the hum of the engines fill the silence. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But each time, it carved out a space within him, a quiet reminder of the world he lived in. High above the clouds, where the world seemed so small, the weight of those moments didn't disappear. It merely waited, suspended in the air, carried forward on the current of an unspoken truth. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tiang An Viet Chuang 3 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Kua Van Da Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song HangEnge. doi tuong noi ngh Illinois sin song tai mai va ko du tui trend 65 tui. Chat GPT da noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 3. Flashbacks and Reflection. The soft glow of the overhead light cast a faint halo on James Carter's open book. But the words blurred together. Unread. Outside the window, the sky stretched endlessly, a canvas of muted grays and blues. It was quiet now, the cabin filled with the steady hum of engines and the occasional murmur of passengers. James shifted in his seat, closing the book and resting it on the tray table. His eyes lingered on the clouds below, their stillness a stark contrast to the restlessness within him. This wasn't new. Airports, planes, waiting rooms, they had all become familiar stages for moments like these. James had learned early in life to move carefully through spaces where he was seen but rarely acknowledged. The sensation was subtle, like walking against the grain of the wind. Most wouldn't notice it, but he did. He always had. The memory came unbidden, slipping into his thoughts like an old song he couldn't forget. He was 12, standing in a department store with his mother. She had been holding a blue sweater against his chest, asking if he liked the color. When the manager approached, "Can I help you find something?" the man had asked. His smile polite but thin, his eyes fixed on their hands. James remembered the way his mother's posture had changed, her shoulders stiffening, her smile becoming sharp and practiced. "We're fine, thank you," she had replied, her voice calm but firm. The manager didn't leave right away. He hovered, his gaze flicking to James, as though expecting him to pull something from the rack and slip it into his pocket. When he finally walked away, his mother placed the sweater back on the hanger and guided James out of the store. Her hand gentle but insistent. Outside, she had knelt down, looking him in the eye. "It's not fair," she had said, her voice steady, "but we don't give them a reason to doubt us. Do you hear me? You stay kind, you stay careful, that's how we get through." He had nodded, not fully understanding but feeling the weight of her words all the same. Years later, he would think of that moment often, how his mother's calm had been a shield, her steadiness a form of defiance. He had carried that lesson with him, worn it like armor in the years that followed. Yet, no amount of kindness or carefulness had been enough to keep the questions, the looks, or the subtle dismissals at bay. James closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the engines steady him. He thought of his father, who had been less gentle but just as resolute. His advice had been simpler, delivered in the quiet of their garage over the sound of a radio playing old blues records. "Don't let it harden you, son," his father had said, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. "The world's heavy enough without carrying that weight too. You hold your head high, no matter what." James smiled faintly, the memory warming him like a worn quilt. His father's words had always been an anchor, even now, decades later. But there were moments when the weight of it all felt inescapable, when the world seemed determined to remind him of his place within it. He glanced around the cabin, his gaze settling on the passengers nearby. Most were absorbed in their own worlds, scrolling through phones or nodding off against the windows. Yet, every so often, a glance would drift his way, linger just a beat too long, before darting away again. It wasn't hostility, it wasn't even unkindness. It was something quieter, something that lived in the spaces between acknowledgement and indifference. James turned back to the window, watching as the clouds thinned to reveal the patchwork of earth below. He wondered how many others carried memories like his, tucked away in the corners of their minds, surfacing only in the stillness of moments like these. He thought of his mother's words, his father's steady hands, and the countless faces he had encountered over the years, some kind, some cold, most somewhere in between. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting slightly before steadying again. James exhaled, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. Life was like that. He thought, a series of small, unpredictable shifts. You learn to ride them out, to adjust without losing your balance. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the landscape. James watched it quietly, letting the light wash over him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that even in the heaviness of the world, there was still space for something gentle, something good. And so, he sat there, high above the ground, the memories settling back into their quiet corners. The hum of the engines carried on, a steady reminder that the world, for all its weight, kept moving forward. 4-0. Van da Noi. Bang Tieng An Viet Chuang 4 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gom Kua Van Da Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song HangEnge. Doi Tuong Noi Nghe La Noi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 4. Conversations and Connections. The flight attendants moved quietly through the cabin, balancing trays of drinks and snacks with practiced ease. James Carter declined the offer of a drink, waving off the attendant with a polite smile. The air around him felt heavy, though he wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the fatigue of travel, or perhaps it was the familiar residue of the day's earlier encounters. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes briefly, letting the muted hum of the plane settle over him. Long day? The voice came from his left. Low but clear. James opened his eyes, turning slightly to see the young woman seated in the aisle seat. She had removed her headphones, her phone now resting face down on the tray table. Her expression was tentative, her gaze steady but not invasive. James hesitated, unsure how much of himself he wanted to share with the stranger. You could say that, he replied finally, his tone measured. She nodded, as though she understood. Traveling for work or personal, he said, keeping his answer brief but not unfriendly. He gestured toward her phone. You? Work, she said, offering a small smile. Well, work and a bit of a break. I'm a writer freelance, mostly. James raised an eyebrow, surprised. That sounds interesting. What do you write? A little bit of everything, she said, her smile widening slightly. Lately, I've been working on pieces about culture and identity, how people navigate the spaces they're in. The stories they carry with them. She paused, her expression shifting to something more thoughtful. It's complicated. James nodded slowly. It is. The conversation settled between them. Unhurried but not awkward. There was a kind of unspoken understanding in the space they shared. A recognition that neither needed to explain too much. James studied her for a moment, noting the curiosity in her eyes. It wasn't the kind of curiosity that sought to pry, but rather one that invited connection. Ever write about airports? He asked, his voice carrying a hint of dry humor. Plenty of stories there. She laughed softly, a sound that felt genuine. I've thought about it. Airports are like little microcosms of the world, aren't they? All these different people, coming and going, crossing paths for just a moment. It's fascinating and sometimes frustrating. James smiled faintly. Frustrating sounds about right. Her expression shifted again, her gaze turning more serious. I saw what happened earlier, she said, her voice quiet. At security. That wasn't right. James's smile faded, his posture stiffening slightly. He looked out the window, the clouds rolling by in endless waves. It happens, he said simply. It shouldn't, she replied, her tone firm but not confrontational. He turned back to her, his eyes meeting hers. There was no pity in her gaze, no self-righteous indignation. Instead, there was something quieter, something that felt like sincerity. No, it shouldn't, he said after a moment, his voice steady. But it does. They sat in silence for a while, the conversation pausing but not ending. James could feel her watching him, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet respect. He wasn't used to that, at least not from strangers. It was disarming in its own way. Does it ever feel heavy? She asked finally, her voice soft. James considered her question, his gaze returning to the window. Sometimes, he admitted, but you learn to carry it. You don't have much of a choice. She nodded, as though she had expected his answer. I think that's what I want to write about, she said, almost to herself. Not the big, loud moments, but the quiet ones, the things people carry that nobody else sees. James turned back to her, studying her for a moment. There was something about her, something earnest, something that reminded him of his younger self before the world had carved its lessons into him. Those are the stories worth telling, he said quietly. She smiled at that, a small but genuine expression. I think so too. The plane began its descent, the cabin filling with the subtle energy of anticipation. Passengers adjusted their seats, gathered their belongings, and prepared for the next stage of their journeys. James felt the shift but didn't move, his conversation with the young woman lingering in his mind. As the plane touched down, he glanced at her one last time. Good luck with your writing, he said, his tone warm but reserved. Thank you, she replied, her voice carrying a quiet sincerity. Safe travels. James nodded, standing to retrieve his bag. As he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, he felt the familiar weight of the world settle back into place. But this time, it felt just a little lighter. Sometimes, he thought, the quiet connections were the ones that mattered most. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tiang An Viet Chuang 5 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Doc Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gom Kua Van Da Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song HangEnge. Doi Tuong Noi Nghe La Noi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 5. A New Challenge. The terminal was alive with the muffled hum of travelers, their voices blending into a steady rhythm beneath the fluorescent lights. James Carter walked with purpose, his carry-on rolling quietly behind him. The flight had been uneventful, but the earlier moments at security and the conversations that followed lingered in his mind like a faint echo. He had long since grown accustomed to compartmentalizing these experiences, tucking them away in the corners of his thoughts. But some days, the weight of them pressed harder than others. As he approached the connecting flight gate, a new announcement played overhead, the attendant's voice crisp and detached. There had been a delay, a mechanical issue, she explained. The words were polite but impersonal, as if designed to diffuse frustration before it could take root. James sighed, glancing at his watch. Another hour, maybe two. He'd waited before, he could wait again. Finding a seat near the gate, he settled in and opened his book, the words offering a momentary escape. Around him, passengers shifted in their seats, adjusted their luggage, and scrolled through their phones. It was a familiar scene. Yet James noticed the subtle tensions that rippled through the room. Delays had a way of unraveling patience, exposing the frayed edges of even the calmest demeanor. The murmurs around him grew louder as a group of uniformed security personnel entered the gate area. Their presence was noticeable but not alarming, at least. Not at first. James glanced up briefly before returning to his book. But a quiet unease began to settle in his chest. Excuse me, sir. The voice was firm, though not impolite. James looked up to see one of the security officers standing before him, a clipboard in hand. Behind him, two other officers hovered, their postures rigid. The officer in front of James gestured toward his bag. We need to conduct a secondary inspection of your luggage, he said, his tone professional but detached. James blinked, his grip tightening slightly on the book in his hands. Is there a problem? He asked, keeping his voice calm. It's a routine check, the officer replied, though the words rang hollow. If you'll come with us, please. The room seemed to grow quieter, the murmur of conversations fading as passengers turned their attention toward the scene unfolding. James could feel their eyes on him, curious, cautious, some openly judgmental. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and followed the officers a short distance to a partitioned area near the gate. The inspection was thorough, more thorough than it needed to be. The officers unpacked his bag piece by piece, their hands moving methodically through his belongings. They asked questions, their tone measured but probing. James answered each one patiently, his responses concise. He could feel the weight of the moment, the unspoken assumptions hanging in the air like a dense fog. Around him, the passengers pretended not to watch, their gazes darting away when he glanced in their direction. But James saw them, the woman clutching her purse a little tighter, the man shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He saw the silent narratives playing out in their minds, the quiet judgments that carried no words but spoke volumes. After what felt like an eternity, the officers finally stepped back. "You're clear," one of them said, his tone neutral. "Thank you for your cooperation." James nodded, carefully repacking his belongings. He didn't speak, didn't challenge them, though the questions burned in his mind. He had learned long ago that resistance only added fuel to the fire. Instead, he moved with the same quiet dignity his mother had taught him. His hands steady despite the anger simmering just beneath the surface. As he returned to his seat, the atmosphere in the gate area seemed to shift. Passengers avoided his gaze, their discomfort palpable. James sat down, exhaling slowly. The young woman from the earlier flight, now seated a few rows away, caught his eye and offered a small, empathetic nod. It was a simple gesture, but it carried more weight than words ever could. The delay stretched on, the minutes ticking by with agonizing slowness. James resumed reading, though the words felt heavier now, harder to focus on. Around him, life carried on, the incident already fading into the background noise of the terminal. But for James, it remained another quiet reminder of the world he navigated daily. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But each moment like this carved a deeper mark, a reminder of the unspoken rules that governed his existence. High above the clouds, the world had seemed distant, almost abstract. But here, on the ground, the weight of it all was inescapable. And so, James sat quietly, his expression calm, his movements steady. To the outside world, he appeared unshaken, just another traveler waiting for his flight. But within him, the echoes of the moment reverberated, a quiet yet persistent reminder of the battles fought in silence every day. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tiang An Viet Chuang 6 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gom Kua Vanda Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hang Enge. Doi Tuong Noi Nghe La Noi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 6. Advocacy and Courage. The gate agent's voice echoed across the terminal, announcing that boarding for the delayed flight would soon begin. James Carter rose from his seat, his carry-on in hand, and moved toward the line forming near the gate. The earlier confrontation with the security officers lingered in his mind, its weight heavier than his bag. Yet, his face betrayed none of it. He moved quietly, deliberately, the way he always had. As the line shuffled forward, James felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find the young woman from the earlier flight standing behind him. Her expression was hesitant but determined. "Hi," she said, her voice low. "I'm sorry to bother you. But I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened back there." James blinked, taken aback by her words. He didn't respond immediately, unsure how to process the unexpected apology. She rushed to fill the silence. "I mean, not that I had anything to do with it," she added quickly, "but I saw it, and it wasn't right." Her sincerity was evident, and for a moment, James felt the sharp edge of his frustration soften. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone measured, "but you don't need to apologize." She hesitated, glancing around as though searching for the right words. "I don't know," she said finally. "It just feels wrong to stay silent. You know, things don't change if we don't speak up." Her words hung in the air, and James studied her for a moment. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with the kind of earnestness that life hadn't yet dulled. It was a quality he admired, even if he no longer shared it. "You're right," he said quietly, "but speaking up isn't always easy." "No, it's not," she admitted, "but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing." James nodded, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The boarding line moved forward, and they parted ways, each heading to their respective seats. But her words stayed with him, their simplicity cutting through the noise of his thoughts. Once seated, James pulled out his phone. For a moment, he hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. Then, with a deep breath, he began typing. The words came slowly at first, each one carefully chosen, until they began to flow more freely. He wrote a detailed account of the incident, describing the actions of the security officers and the effect it had on him. He avoided dramatics, sticking instead to the facts. He knew from experience that emotions could be dismissed, but facts were harder to ignore. When he was finished, he reviewed the message carefully before sending it to the airline's customer service email and copying a civil rights organization he had worked with in the past. As the plane taxied down the runway, James leaned back in his seat, a strange mix of relief and apprehension settling over him. He had never been one to seek out conflict, but he knew the importance of documenting these moments. It wasn't just about him, it was about the countless others who experienced the same indignities without the means or the will to speak out. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, their voices calm and rehearsed. Around him, passengers settled into their routines, reading, chatting, staring out the windows. The young woman from earlier caught his eye across the aisle, offering him a small nod. He returned it, a silent acknowledgement of her earlier words. As the plane ascended, James stared out the window, the ground falling away beneath them. He thought about his parents, their quiet resilience, and the lessons they had imparted. He thought about the many times he had chosen silence over confrontation. Not out of fear but out of necessity. And he thought about the young woman's voice, clear and steady, insisting that silence wasn't enough. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to stop carrying the weight alone. High above the clouds, James allowed himself a moment of stillness. The act of writing the complaint had been small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But it was a step towards something greater. Change, he knew, didn't come all at once. It came in moments, in decisions, in the courage to speak up when silence was easier. And so, as the plane leveled out and the cabin filled with the steady hum of engines, James closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to hope. 4-0. Van da Noi. Bang Tiang An Viet Chuang 7 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Doc Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gom Kua Vanda Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song HangEnge. Doi Tuong Noi Ngh Illinois Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 7. The Aftermath. The airport terminal was quieter than usual, its wide spaces echoing only the soft shuffle of footsteps and the occasional announcement over the intercom. James Carter sat at a small cafe near the baggage claim, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. The drink was too hot, but he held it anyway, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. The act of sitting still felt unfamiliar after a long day of navigating crowded planes and watchful eyes. He glanced at his phone, where an automated reply from the airline confirmed receipt of his complaint. The message was polite, almost formulaic, thanking him for his feedback and assuring him that his concerns would be reviewed. James had seen similar messages before, and while he appreciated the acknowledgement, he knew better than to expect immediate action. Still, something about sending it felt like progress, even if only a small step. Across the table, his seatmate from the flight stood with her suitcase, preparing to leave. She had stopped to chat briefly after they landed, her tone casual but laced with sincerity. Now, as she reached for her coat, she offered him a final nod. "Good luck with everything," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "I hope they listen." James nodded in return, his expression calm. "Thank you," he said simply. She hesitated, as if wanting to say more, but then turned and walked away, her footsteps fading into the buzz of the terminal. James watched her go, feeling a mix of gratitude and resignation. It was a kind gesture, but gestures alone wouldn't change much. He sipped his coffee, staring absently at the people around him. Travelers hurried by, their faces etched with varying degrees of fatigue and purpose. To them, he was just another man at a table, indistinguishable from the countless others they passed every day. Yet James knew that his presence, his very existence, was often seen differently, defined by assumptions and biases that hovered just beneath the surface. The thought brought him back to a moment earlier in the flight. Just after he had sent the email, A flight attendant had approached him. Her smile polite but guarded. "Is everything okay, sir?" she had asked. Her tone careful. James had looked up from his phone, startled by the question. "Yes," he had replied, keeping his voice steady. "Why?" She had hesitated, glancing briefly at his phone before responding. "Just wanted to make sure you're comfortable. Let us know if you need anything." Her words had been innocuous enough. But James had sensed the undercurrent of something else, perhaps concern. Or perhaps an attempt to manage a situation that didn't yet exist. He had thanked her and returned to his book. But the interaction lingered in his mind. It was a small moment. But it spoke volumes about the assumptions that followed him everywhere he went. Now, sitting in the terminal, James considered those moments, the countless small interactions that added up to something far greater than the sum of their parts. He thought of the security screening, the thorough inspection of his bag, the sidelong glances from fellow passengers. None of it had been overtly hostile. But it all carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. The sound of his phone vibrating pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw an email notification from a civil rights organization he had copied on his complaint. Opening the message, he read their response carefully. It was brief but encouraging, expressing interest in his experience and offering to follow up on his behalf. They asked if he would be willing to share more details or participate in a larger effort to address similar issues. James set the phone down, his mind racing. He had not expected such a swift reply. Nor had he considered the possibility of his complaint becoming part of something bigger. The idea was daunting but also intriguing. For years, he had carried these moments quietly, telling himself that they were just part of life, that speaking out wouldn't make a difference. But maybe he had been wrong. As he finished his coffee, James felt a sense of resolve settling over him. He didn't know what would come of the email or if his actions would lead to any real change. But he knew one thing for certain: staying silent hadn't worked. Perhaps it was time to try something different. The terminal's intercom crackled to life, announcing another arriving flight. James stood, tossing his empty cup into a nearby trash can. He picked up his bag and walked toward the exit, his steps steady and deliberate. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and distant rain. For the first time in a long while, James felt the weight of the day begin to lift. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it was lighter. And as he stepped into the cool evening air, he allowed himself a small, quiet hope that the weight might not be his alone to carry anymore. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tiang An Viet Chuang 8 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gom Kua Van Da Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hang Enge. Doi Tuong Noi Ngh Hila Noi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Tren 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 8. Resolution and Growth. The days following his flight were quiet. But James Carter felt the ripple of change beneath the stillness. He returned to his routine early mornings with coffee, long walks through his neighborhood, afternoons spent reading. Yet, there was something different, an undercurrent of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The civil rights organization had kept their word. A representative reached out, this time over the phone, their voice calm and encouraging. They had reviewed his account and were compiling similar experiences shared by other travelers. This isn't isolated, the representative said. Your story is part of a larger pattern. And we believe it's time for these practices to be addressed more publicly. Would you consider speaking about it? James hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he sought out. And he wasn't sure he wanted to step into the spotlight. But as the silence stretched between them, he thought about the countless moments he'd endured quiet, heavy, and unchallenged. He thought about his parents' lessons in resilience and dignity, about the young woman on the plane who had encouraged him to speak up. I'll think about it, he said finally. The days turned into weeks, and James's story began to gather momentum. The organization published his account, alongside others, as part of a larger report on racial profiling in security protocols. It was picked up by several news outlets, sparking conversations online and in communities across the country. James read the comments with a mix of hope and caution. Some voices were supportive, sharing their own stories of similar treatment. Others dismissed the experiences outright, insisting that security measures were necessary and impartial. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, his phone buzzed with another email. This one was from the airline. It wasn't the automated reply he'd grown used to, but a formal acknowledgement from a senior representative. They apologized for his experience, assuring him that they were reviewing their policies and offering to meet with him to discuss potential changes. James stared at the email for a long time. He had seen apologies like this before, carefully worded, calculated to deflect criticism while showing just enough concern to appease. Yet, something about this one felt different. It wasn't just the words, it was the timing, the context, the fact that it had followed weeks of public scrutiny. Perhaps it was performative, perhaps it was genuine. Either way, it was a step. When the meeting finally took place, James sat across the table from airline representatives and members of the civil rights organization. The conversation was professional, measured, but not without tension. James spoke plainly, recounting his experiences without embellishment. He didn't raise his voice or demand retribution. Instead, he focused on the broader impact: how these practices eroded trust, how they perpetuated cycles of prejudice under the guise of routine procedure. By the end of the meeting, small but meaningful commitments were made. The airline pledged to review their training protocols, promising to include implicit bias education for their staff. It wasn't a sweeping victory, but it was a beginning. And James left the meeting with a sense of cautious optimism. Months later, as he walked through the same airport where the incident had occurred, James noticed small changes. Security officers moved with the same efficiency, but their interactions seemed more deliberate, less perfunctory. Passengers of all backgrounds were treated with the same level of attention, or at least that was how it appeared. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As he approached the gate, James saw the young woman from the plane standing near the window. She was staring out at the tarmac, her expression thoughtful. When she noticed him, she smiled. "Mr. Carter," she said, stepping closer. "It's good to see you again." "You too," James replied, his tone warm but understated. "I read about your story," she said. "It's inspiring, what you've done." "Thank you." James nodded, his gaze steady. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It never is." The boarding announcement played over the intercom, and James turned toward the gate. As he handed his ticket to the agent, he felt a small, quiet sense of accomplishment. The journey wasn't over, not for him, and not for others like him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like the world had shifted, however slightly, in the right direction. High above the clouds once again, James leaned back in his seat, his book open on his lap. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady reminder that life carried on. And for the first time, the weight he carried felt less like a burden and more like a purpose.